Last night Robin asked me if there would be breakfast here, and I said, well, they always have cake. And she totally made fun of me. She knew what I was talking about.
Breakfast cake.
Yeah. She said if you eat it in the morning, it's bread.
It's bread. Yeah,
I got quick
it works
bread.
for me, yeah.
Is that the extent of your disagreements at home? Pretty good.
Well, as we get started here, some of you took the course last summer, and we've got some new faces also, so that's great. We'll start with just some introductions, first to us, and then talk a little bit about the idea behind the class. Other housekeeping things, schedule-wise, some of you might remember from last year, we generally do this in 2 sessions. So we'll do the first session where we'll discuss the text and some of the things that we've found. We'll pose some questions and things to reflect on. Then we'll take a short break, and then we start the second session with any questions you might have or comments, and kind of start the discussion aspect to start the second session. And so all of us are distracted and absent-minded and everything you would expect. So sometimes if we have questions throughout, it takes us off track. So if you'll hold questions until the second session, that would be great. I've met most of you, but not all of you. I'm Dusty Gates. I work here in adult education. I've been working here for 6 years now. I've been with the diocese for 11 years, I think. I taught a few years in the Catholic schools. Do a little work at Newman University as well. And I've invited 2 of my friends and colleagues and fellow teachers here, Matthew Umbarger and Howard Clark, and I'll let them kind of introduce themselves.
Matthew Umbarger. I teach theology at Newman University. I'm really an Old Testament guy, and when I'm lucky, I get to kind of focus on the Old Testament. Grew up on a farm in southeast Kansas, and I'll be working cattle later this week with my dad, so I'm still pretty much a farm boy who likes highfalutin stuff. And when you get to reading like Gilgamesh, it's a classic, but as you read it, you realize there's something to appeal to everybody in a book like this.
Is that it?
Yes.
I'm Howard Clark. I've joined the forces of the unemployed. Actually, what I do is I retired after 40 years of teaching. And So I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. At least for the next 8 weeks, I think I know what I'm going to be doing, and that's good. I've taught in both. I've taught from 6th grade to seniors in high school. So I've taught in a boys' school, public schools, parochial schools. I just finished 6 years at Blessed Sacrament, and I had the good fortune of being at a school where I was able to teach a junior-senior sequence on humanities. So I had the really a privilege of getting to go over certain books for 20 years, and refamiliarizing myself each year. So when I got the opportunity to work with these 2 guys, I jumped at it because it's fun to go back and read these things and think about them, and hopefully we'll have some insights for you.
So for those of you who weren't here last year, this course is kind of the inspiration that we got from this is from the Integrated Humanities program that some of you I know were part of, and certainly most of you are probably familiar with that. And Howard is a product of that. And
don't blame that on the professors. That's not fair.
So the idea behind this class was that we would select 8 books, and we would read them for enjoyment, but also read them critically, not in the kind of modern sense of criticism, but with an eye to revelation, with an eye to theology, history, anthropology, and as we found last year, is we found these themes that kept coming up in the books that was very similar to the theme that was of interest to the sacred authors of Scripture, to the fathers of the church, to modern day theologians up to the present. And we didn't find that to be coincidental, and certainly in the history of our reading, and I'm sure of yours, you probably didn't find that to be coincidental either. And one of the questions that we kind of asked ourselves is why should we be reading books like this?
Yeah. I was just thinking about, as you were talking about that, it's kind of like tapping into the cultural DNA of the church. Because the church didn't come on the scene and eradicate all the Christian culture that was before it. It did challenge it. It didn't allow it to just continue unchallenged. There were a lot of things. There was a lot of repenting to do. But it took what was good and true and beautiful and claimed it for Jesus as being actually, originally from the Father. In some kind of mysterious sense. This is what we're struggling with. Is in what sense is there kind of a universal, general revelation that all peoples are participating in? Specifically, those cultures that would eventually be taken up into what we think of as Western culture. It didn't just arrive from nowhere. And you mentioned the church fathers. It's interesting. Some of the church fathers talk about, for instance, the lies of Homer, and then you read other church fathers and they quote him willy-nilly and with approval, and I think that's kind of where we're at, even individually, as we read these things. Sometimes we read them, it takes our breath away, and then the next minute we're like, how is it that this prostitute's bringing civilization to this guy? So these are. I think this is the situation that the church has always been in.
Yeah, sometimes we find a real narrow view of Revelation. We think that Revelation is something that fell out of the sky, in a bound version like this, and that there was no other revelation. But some of the authors that we've been discussing in recent weeks. Joseph Pieper, blessed soon-to-be Saint John Henry Newman, all these great thinkers have identified, J.R.R. Tolkien, have identified in their study of ancient cultures, what some have called an original revelation or a primordial revelation, to use the language of Pieper, I think. And that's a real thing, and I think sometimes maybe a more fundamentalist bent on Christianity would be scandalized by that. And when they see things like what we'll talk about today that are very similar to what we find in Scripture, they don't know what to do with that. Whereas as a thinking Catholic with this history of tradition in our back pocket, we can use that to make Scripture, in this case, all that much more beautiful and valid and enriching to us. And so I think that we've been having a great time doing that so far, and we're looking forward to doing that with you all here today and for the next 8 weeks.
And most of us have been blessed with 2 eyes, and one of the church fathers talks about with one eye you have to read with a certain bit of hold back a little bit, judge it. There are things in there which if not thought about it critically can lead you seriously astray, but you have another eye where you're looking for the truth, which is out there, and that the combination of those two gives you a certain kind of depth perception where you can really begin to understand to a certain extent the truth that is involved in all these different world religions. You have to be kind of careful because you can kind of flip that on its head and make it seem like, well, they're all the same, and that's where the critical eye has to come in and say, well, no, that's not it either. But at the same time, there are revealed truths there, which and then the coming of Christ helps to clarify and restore those, and also reject, to make it clear what things really do need to be rejected. And there are a few things in here where you could probably say, well, I don't know about that. So.
So in my Bible college, which was more of a fundamentalist sort of setting, when we struggled, so we'll talk about the story of the flood later in Gilgamesh. And you compare the story in here and you compare the story in the Bible, and it's obvious that there are connections. And in my Bible college, they just said this was a knockoff of the Bible. Okay? But that's not helpful. It's not, because there's so much evidence that. But it's wrong to say this is just like some of the agnostics and atheists at the beginning when this literature was first translated in English. A lot of them try to say, well, the Bible's just a knockoff, and that's not helpful either, and that's not true either. The relationship between these two bodies of the literature is a little more complicated than that. And I'm sure we won't get to the end of that discussion today.
No, that one's going to go on for a long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you'll find is that by becoming acquainted with the pagan literature, it really puts Scripture and divine revelation into perspective, I think. I think you can appreciate the Bible more when you become aware of what it's borrowing from and baptizing, to use that metaphor, but also to see what it's countering. In a lot of the beautiful thing about the Bible is it will take, Augustine talks about plundering the Egyptians, right? He takes the gold, Israel took the gold from Egypt and they used it to build a tabernacle in which to worship the Lord. It's an act of spiritual warfare of sorts, and you see that happening, I think, in the pages of Scripture. It's looting everything. They're aware of these books, but they're using them for a very different purpose. The other thing about this literature is it's just beautiful, and I think any exposure to beauty is going to be good for our soul and our relationship with the God who is the source of beauty.
Well, so the first, and I know not everyone was able to get their hands on a copy of this, and so kind of as we said in the advertisement, the books are not required, and certainly not that you have the same edition as the ones that we'll be using. But we do try to carry, I just checked, I think we're sold out right now of this, but I'm going to order more copies of all the books that we're using. So we do carry these books in our bookstore, 8th-day books. You might call ahead, but I'm assuming that they have pretty much everything that we're using in stock.
They're out of Gilgamesh.
We're out of Gilgamesh right now.
Oh.
My daughter says they had a run on Gilgamesh. My daughter's working there, and she came in. She goes, "What is this deal on Gilgamesh? Everybody's buying it." And I said, "Well, it probably has something to do with this class." And she said, "Yeah, but there are other people that are coming in." And I didn't realize this. I did a little bit of reading, and evidently this is quite a popular. I mean, it's we're really with it. We're reading Gilgamesh. Like my whole life I've tried to be with it, and I've just always failed, and then I stumble onto it, and I found out, hey, I'm relevant. I'm reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, so who knew?
I thought we were creating a buzz.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I think we set the edge on that one.
Does
Right.
does the bookstore know what books, if I just went in and said I need the books for the class?
Whoever's working at you're talking about 8th-day books. 8th-day books might not know, or you'd probably have to tell them what's on our list.
But downstairs they would know.
But downstairs they would know,
Okay.
or should. Yeah.
Father joked about the fact last year we read fat books, and this
Yes.
year we're reading skinny books, which really was last year. The reading list was really. No offense to anybody who came up with it, but it was a little on the ridiculous side.
Maybe more.
I think I've hurt his feelings. He's leaving now.
He's left.
Yeah, and I remember the time saying, gosh, this is an ambitious reading list. Who can do this? And so we just did. We pulled out parts and we talked about them, and that was fine too. But this year we really did make an effort to try to pick things that, if you did want to read the entire work, with your schedules and everything else, really pretty much all of them I think are pretty doable. This book, half of that's an introduction. The actual story isn't really all that, at least the way that we received it. And but at the same time, if you want to read the text after we talk about it, there's a lot to be said for that too. Sometimes then you'll kind of have a sense of what am I looking for as I read through that. So, but anyway, we did make an effort to make it doable this year.
In the humanities program, were you expected to have it all read before you showed up in class, or
they would say things like, you need to read the first half of this book or third of it, but there was I don't know, there was a little bit of freedom about that. I always waited until actually I heard the lectures and then I started reading, because then I knew sort of what I was trying to look for and all that. It kind of gave me a blueprint a little bit. I'm sure there were real ambitious students who read everything early on, and I wasn't one of those.
You had time later.
Yeah.
You're getting to do it now.
Yeah, but I've I've had a chance to reread them again, so all of these are worth reading again and again.
Yeah. Shall we jump into
Sure.
book of the day?
Okay, so who is Gilgamesh? And if you have this edition which is the same as this edition. Penguin. It's a really nice introduction. There was one bit in here that really aggravated me, where she talks about how, the Canaanite or possibly Palestinian version of Gilgamesh. There was no Palestinian version of Gilgamesh because there were no Palestinians at the time of the northern kingdom of Israel. This would have been the Israelite version of Gilgamesh. It was a very peculiar political anyway. But anyway, the introduction is very good, apart from that little thing. But Gilgamesh was a historical figure, really seems to have been. Probably was originally named Bilgamesh. In our old Sumerian, oldest versions, that's what he's called, is Bilgamesh. And he was probably one of the first of these emperors, perhaps. Meaning that every city, so imagine this, if Wichita had its own king, and Hutchinson had its own king, and El Dorado had its own king.
How about Hayesville? Do they get a
Hayesville. Maybe a dukedom. Yeah. But all these places were city-states. And, they got along or fought, but they were all independent of one another. And then one day, the king of Wichita decided, things would be a lot more efficient if he just was in charge of all of them. And that's what you hear empire, and I think you think of the Roman Empire, this vast kingdom that's ruling over all of these, what were independent states of all different kinds of peoples. But really the first empires were one king thumping all the other kings around and building what we would consider a kingdom. But what's different is that you have one king who's ruling over many city-states and not just one. Gilgamesh seems to be one of these early characters who did this. But we don't know much about the history of Gilgamesh. We do know that after he died, there was a cult erected to him, meaning there was a liturgy associated with him. People were worshiping him, probably not in the same sense that they were the great gods, the Anunnaki, they call them in Sumerian, but he would have been kind of a demigod figure. which is interesting considering that the whole story of Gilgamesh is this angst about death and what's going to happen to death. But he was worshipped very much like the Greeks would worship. They had a cult to Hercules and to all of these other demigod figures. And that's why we have the literature that we have. These stories, these narratives, would originally have been composed to chant in a liturgical setting, celebrating the life of Gilgamesh. Which, again, you think about what's in here, that's an interesting idea in of itself, because this doesn't all seem like high liturgical literature, but religion's a little different back then. It was originally written in Sumerian, probably not just one epic, it was probably a lot of individual stories about Gilgamesh, or songs about Gilgamesh. What we have here in this book is the translation of the Akkadian version of Gilgamesh. Try not to bore you with this, but basically the Sumerians, we don't know a whole lot about the Sumerians still. We understand their language, we understand quite a bit about their culture. We don't know who they were ethnically. We don't know where they came from. Their language is completely unique. It's not part of another language family, but they lived in today what we know as Iraq. In fact, Uruk, which you read about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is ancient Sumerian for Iraq. That's where Iraq comes from, actually. The Sumerians were, there's a big debate between Sumeriologists and Egyptologists about who was first on the scene as far as creating civilization. But I think the Sumerians have a really good claim to that. The Sumerians seem to have invented beer. And I think that is worthy of taking the civilization trophy right there. We have recipes in Sumerian for the beer. I've heard of people who've tried to copy them. I've heard it tastes like crap, but anyway, the first go isn't usually too good. But they were a remarkable people, and then the Semites came, the Semitic peoples. And you know of the Semitic peoples mostly through the Jewish people, who are one of many, many different nations in the Semitic peoples. And really Hammurabi, you've probably all heard of Hammurabi, the Babylonian a Semite. He's probably more than anyone else responsible for the demise of the Sumerians. They probably didn't eradicate them. It wasn't a genocide or something like this. They just conquered them and then absorbed them into their own people. But when that happened, the language, the dominant language of the area, which had been Sumerian, shifted to the Semitic language of Akkadian, which is very similar to Hebrew, yeah? And Arabic and some of these other Semitic languages. What's remarkable is the Akkadian peoples, these Semitic invaders, emperors, they took the Sumerian language and they took their writing system, for instance, and they just adopted it wholesale. And they wrote Akkadian with it. They wrote the sounds that you would make with Sumerian, except they wrote Akkadian words with them, with cuneiform. Are you all familiar with cuneiform when I talk about this writing? Okay. The wedge writing is what it means. You take a clay tablet and a reed stylus and you would make these little wedges. And so they took all of those symbols and incorporated it into their language, their writing system, and they even took a lot of their words. And to this day, even in Hebrew, there are a number of Sumerian words. Heikal, which is the Hebrew word for palace or temple, comes from the Sumerian word E-gal-lu, which means house of the big man. Okay. My favorite is Tarnagol in Hebrew, which means chicken. It is Tarnagalu. Galu is big man. It's the big man's bird, the king's bird. So they like chicken in Sumerian. Evidently, only the king got to eat it. This language in this culture of Sumerian civilization, even though it is dominated by the Akkadians, in some ways it winds up dominating the Middle Eastern culture. And it colors even our Bible, even though there's not a lick of... The word Sumer never shows up in the Bible. That's what's kind of remarkable about this. You all know a Sumerian word. The word abyss comes to us via Greek, abyssos. They took it from Abzu, which is a Sumerian word. So, anyway, I geek out about this stuff. Forgive me. So this is what's happened here. Is I think this is a 7th century version of a 7th century BC version of a story that was much, much older, probably going back to the 3rd millennium BC. Okay. And this story has just been retold and retold and retold until eventually it's transcribed into Akkadian. And what's remarkable, I'm going to show you a little while later some of the scraps of the Sumerian version that are left, and there are very many points of contact. Actually, I think some of the Sumerians much better. They dumbed it down, if you will. Probably didn't understand everything they were looking at.
So putting this on a timeline with Homer, so this predates Homer, like what we started with last.
Yeah. This version, the Akkadian version, may be contemporaneous with Homer. But certainly the story itself is much, much older. What else? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Gilgamesh in the Bible. Did you have anything else? I've been going on for a bit. I don't want to...
I was still on the big man's bird.
The big man's bird. So does Gilgamesh show up in the Bible? Possibly. So if you go to Genesis chapter 11.
You don't need to turn there, but if anybody does want a Bible, I've got them on a cart over there.
Excuse me, chapter 10. So, verse 8. So Genesis chapter 10, verse 8 tells us about Cush. Some people think that Cush in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 is not the Cush of later biblical passages that is associated with Ethiopia, but it's actually Sumer. The territory that's described, that's associated with Cush, is Mesopotamia and not Africa. So, I don't know. But anyway, it says Cush became the father of Nimrod, who was the first to become a mighty warrior on earth. He was a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, so there's enough there that already suggests a point of contact with Gilgamesh. A warrior, mighty hunter, there's a lot of hunting in the book. But then the next verse becomes more interesting. His kingdom originated in Babylon, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. So that Erech is Uruk, the kingdom of Gilgamesh. Later, in chapter 11, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And in the biblical text, the people just decide together to build a tower. Their motive is interesting. Verse 4, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered all over the earth. And so this anxiety about making a name for oneself that we see in Genesis 11 also sounds a lot like Gilgamesh. And interestingly, in Jewish Midrash, this isn't just some kind of spontaneous idea that all the people get together. It's Nimrod. Nimrod is the one who wants to build the Tower of Babel. There are these kinds of points of contact between Nimrod and Gilgamesh that are interesting. Even if Nimrod is not Gilgamesh, he's certainly a Gilgamesh-type character. I think that's clear. As I read Gilgamesh, these are some of the themes that come to my mind. So there's the pursuit of glory. Let's make a name for myself. That's a dominant theme. Gilgamesh is obsessed with glory, addicted to it. He's also, I think of this as the first comic book in some ways. You even have a dynamic duo of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And I don't think that's accidental. I think a lot of our comic book authors are in a way trying to craft a new American mythology. So there are some parallels there. Certainly friendship is a major theme of the book. It's a beautiful, beautiful story of friendship when you read on that level. A lot of it reminds me of David and Jonathan. Reading again his lament over Enkidu, I was thinking of David's lament over Jonathan. There are echoes of, again, I don't think the author of 1st, 2nd Samuel knew Gilgamesh, but it's very evocative of it all the same.
To interrupt
Please.
even some of the language, we find that it could have been coincidental, but certainly catches my eye. So the story of in the Tower of Babel, we hear the language of the molding of bricks and the hardening of the bricks by fire, which might have been a common phrase for, I don't know, but we find similar language with. I'm in the Forest Journey on page 70. If you've got this edition, when we have Gilgamesh speaking to Enkidu, and he says, this is before they enter go to the mountain to get the cedars. He says, I have not established my name stamped on bricks as my destiny decreed. Therefore, I will go to the country where the cedar is felled. I will set up my name in the place where the names of famous men are written. So we have a lot of common language. Oh yeah. Really, from a few chapters there in Genesis, name, the heart. So and I think we were talking the other day about Genesis chapter 6, and we get the men. Sometimes that's translated, I believe, into English as the men of name or the men of renown. Mm-hmm. And then the setting up of the name, and so that becomes. In the Old Testament, that becomes a real dividing point of those whose names have been won for themselves and those whose name has come through the gift of God. So that kind of distinction of Nimrod and the men of Babel is kind of representing, these are the men who are trying to win name for themselves, whereas God freely gives name to Shem in the blessing from Noah.
And especially to Abraham.
Right.
I will make a name for you.
Right.
Yeah, in Genesis chapter 12.
Right. That seems like even in our, again, we'll try not to go back to last year too much because we know that not all of you read those texts, but even last year that seemed to be a theme, is there's this fine line between, winning glory for yourself and then receiving glory from God in accordance with His purpose, or the gods in some of these pagan literature, but.
There's also, it just occurs to me as you say this, I think another major theme here, and I've been struggling with this as I reread it, is he's, at every turn, the gods are not his friends. That's another thing when you consider this is a text that might have been used for worship. It doesn't paint the gods in a nice way, but I was just reminded of the verse in Proverbs that God opposes the proud. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly a theme here. He's pursuing his own ambition, and at every turn, it just kind of comes to naught. And that's also the theme of the story of the Tower of Babel, of course. So that's.
And it continues even, in character. You could say even through the New Testament, but you already mentioned David. I mean, we see that tension going on of somebody who's been given a mission by God. Right. But he's not able to extricate his pride from that. And so sometimes there's this ambiguity of, is this something I'm trying to set up for for my own glory, or is it for God's glory? And so even with the temple motif, I kind of think
Right.
about that, of the whole building of the temple, and
Yeah.
and the fact that David wasn't able to complete it. So I'm kind of thinking about that
Oh, yeah.
as I'm reading this Gilgamesh's attempt to make a name for himself,
Yeah.
and seeing him grapple with that.
Yeah.
Do you think the, I don't really know much of anything about all this, so I kind of read everything through the lens of, Greek literature, but,
Which I don't think is wrong. I think.
okay.
Yeah.
But so, and I know we're going to talk about the afterlife later on, but do you think that the desire to make a name for yourself, that it's always because they know what comes afterwards, and that, in other words, there's this, you see that with the Greek heroes, that there is this,
Yeah.
they want to make a name for themselves because they want a certain sense of immortality, because they know once they die, their existence is fairly meaningless in Hades. This seems to be even worse.
Yeah. I would agree.
And so do you think that that's part of that also, do you think? I mean,
For sure. Yeah, I think part of it is also I didn't give all of the text from the Sumerian version. When we'll see, there's some interesting stuff in that about the afterlife. But one of the ideas in Sumeria, and certainly in Assyria and Babylon, is that your enjoyment of the afterlife kind of depends on people coming and remembering you and making offerings. And
okay.
so
So I
it-
did notice there were a different level. I mean, some people had it pretty bad, and other people just had it
That's right.
bad, and it was all pretty bad, but some people had it worse.
Yeah.
So that part of that is like, they were being remembered, so,
Mhm.
oh, okay.
Are they making offerings to you?
Okay.
In Ugarit, which is just north of Israel, they've found these tombs. They think mostly of the royal family, but perhaps of other dignitaries. This wouldn't have been for normal, let's say even middle class people probably. But they find these tombs and they all have these holes drilled into the coffin lid.
Okay.
And they think that this was for pouring libations down. So like, I'm thinking of like gangsta rap, like
Pour it on the curb.
or something, right. But it's a little bit of that, like you're sharing this conviviality, even like that's ironic, isn't it? This conviviality with the dead, even, and that's a way of including them in life. And if you forget them, yeah, tough luck. It is weird. A few weeks ago, I had like this sense of existential dread of what it would be like to be forgotten after I died. Like in a few. This is how it happened. I was thinking about my ancestors, and I can trace on some parts of my family. I can trace back clear to the 1400s. But most of my family, I have no idea where I came from. I've forgotten their names. And I realized that is likely to happen to me. Someday I will have descendants running around who don't know where they came from. And this just dread of that washed over me. And if it weren't for the hope that we have in Christ, that really would be terrifying. And
Yeah, there's when my grandmother died, I had a real sense of loss. Like, why didn't we should have written down all of her memories.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody's had that experience. Like, why? I took this for granted.
Yeah.
And now we have these pictures at home, and I'm looking at them and like, I have no idea who this is, or there'll be something written on the back, and I just know, okay, well, somehow there's a connection here, but I don't know what it is, and it's very sad.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So that kind of amnesia about where you came from, and then to realize that amnesia, I'm going to be included in that amnesia.
Yep.
As Catholics, I want people praying for me, you know.
Absolutely.
So I guess you don't really have to know everybody's name, but it'd be nice at least for 4 generations, people. Remember, and then hopefully by then you're out of purgatory if you made it to purgatory. So,
Amen.
yeah.
Yeah, yesterday I visited both of my grandmas yesterday, and my grandma Gates is 91 now, and I was looking at some pictures on her wall, and she said, "Do you know who that woman is?" And I looked at the picture and I said, "No, I guess." I said, "Is that your mother?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "And what was her first name?" And she had forgotten. I mean, she has good days and bad, but I felt terrible that I'd asked the question, because I could see on her eyes that she was so upset that she didn't know her name. And so that retaining the name. So yeah, whenever we read these characters that are wanting to preserve their name.
I can't remember my kids' names
Make up new ones for them. But that's part of in the introduction, the translator talks about this pessimism that seems to color all of this literature. And I think we see Gilgamesh kind of struggling through that and kind of being tempted. I think it's Ishtar who is kind of offering him this advice, like, well, just eat, drink, and be merry.
Can I read that?
Please.
That's Siduri, the
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, Siduri.
Yeah, that's right.
barmaid is one
That's
way
right.
her name means.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, Siduri is awesome. Yeah, Siduri is my daughter's favorite character in Gilgamesh. So I hope I don't have a granddaughter named Siduri someday. She really likes Siduri.
Well, she'll never be out of work.
So this text is beautiful, this advice that she gives Gilgamesh, and it reminds me of Ecclesiastes.
What page is that on?
Page 102 in the Penguin version.
What book is it that you
Oh, yeah, I don't have that. It's Gilgamesh. It is in...
The Search for Everlasting Life.
it's
is
in
the chapter.
tablet 4. So you may be able to find it in your version
Did you
if
say
you have that.
102?
Page 102.
Right, and this one is 102, yeah.
It's just about halfway through tablet 4. So Siduri answered Gilgamesh.
You really ought to back up and read his, because Gilgamesh keeps in this section.
That's true.
Everybody just says, "Who are you?" "Well, I'm Gilgamesh." "Well, why do you look so worn out and draggled?" And he goes, "Well, and then he keeps repeating this thing. There's a lot of pathos in it. So.
And there's a lot of repetition as
Right.
well. So you see that the Semitic literature loves repetition. Even the Sumerian version is even more repetitious. Just to set this up a bit, Enkidu has died. Gilgamesh has mourned him, but he's also begun to think of his own mortality. And so he goes on this quest because he's heard that Utnapishtim, the Noah of Gilgamesh, who lives in Dilmun, which is basically Eden, that he has the secret of eternal life. So he's on this quest to find him, but getting there is really, really difficult. So Siduri, I'll start here on page 101, that first paragraph there. Siduri said to him, "If you are that Gilgamesh who seized and killed the bull of heaven, who killed the watchman of the cedar forest, who overthrew Umbaba that lived in the forest and killed the lions in the passes of the mountain, why are your cheeks so starved and why is your face so drawn? Why is despair in your heart and your face like the face of one who has made a long journey? Yes, why is your face burned from heat and cold, and why do you come here, wandering over the pastures in search of the wind?" Gilgamesh answered her, "And why should not my cheeks be starved and my face drawn? Despair is in my heart, and my face is the face of one who has made a long journey. It was burned with heat and with cold. Why should I not wander over the pastures in search of the wind? My friend, my younger brother, he who hunted the wild ass of the wilderness and the panther of the plains. My friend, my younger brother who seized and killed the bull of heaven and overthrew Humbaba in the cedar forest. My friend, who was very dear to me and who endured dangers beside me, Enkidu, my brother, whom I loved. The end of mortality has overtaken him. I wept for him 7 days and nights till the worm fastened on him." Earlier, there's this beautiful scene where he doesn't even want to bury Enkidu. Like, he thinks he's going to wake up And then when the worms appear, he's like, so he finally just becomes resigned to his death. Because of my brother, I am afraid of death. Because of my brother, I stray through the wilderness and cannot rest. But now, young woman, maker of wine, since I have seen your face, do not let me see the face of death, which I dread so much. She answered, Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things. Day and night, night and day, dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh. Bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. Now, does this remind anyone of a book of the Bible? Yeah. Something older than St. Paul. St. Paul is quoting something else.
Ecclesiastes.
This is Ecclesiastes. And to me, I think Ecclesiastes and Gilgamesh have a lot of links. Which is interesting to me because everyone says Ecclesiastes has to be a very late book of the Old Testament. Because so this is what the Germans said in the 19th century. Germans who didn't like Jews too much. So there's no way a Jew could come up with all of this on their own. So they must have ripped it off of the Greeks. And they say that Ecclesiastes is a product of Greek Epicureanism. That sounds like Gilgamesh to me. I don't think you need Epicureanism to write Ecclesiastes. I think it's already in the cultural DNA of the Middle East. Not that there couldn't be points of contact with Epicureanism, but it's not because they had to depend on some. It's not a Greek knockoff.
You know, when you reread that, when she says, why are you here wandering over the pastures in search of the wind?
Mm-hmm.
And
Vanity.
that's one way you can translate vanity. I mean, that basically it's just you're chasing the wind.
Yeah.
There's nothing there.
That's
So
right.
I would say, and then that's repeated again.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a.
And the whole story of Gilgamesh is he's trying to experience life to the full. He's trying everything. And the whole reason they go to Lebanon to fight Humbaba is because he's looking for something else to do. Because he's tried everything. He's done it all. And which also is very much like Ecclesiastes. And he proves that that life lived in this sort of way, lived for one's own glory, winds up being meaningless. So I think there's a lot of Ecclesiastes in Gilgamesh.
The last year we read the Odyssey and the Phaeacians. So when Odysseus leaves Calypso's island and he's shipwrecked at sea and he lands there, and it talks about it. This is what they do. They dance.
Right.
They feast. When he shows up, they're having a feast. Well, it turns out that's pretty much what they do all the time.
Right.
And they have clean clothes, and he's kind of invited to. I mean, that in a way becomes sort of a temptation, because the princess says, you could stay here and be my husband, and so. I hadn't really thought about that, but there's sort of kind of an echo there also.
Yeah. It's kind of an Epicurean island.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think some people have thought that might have echoes of Dilmun as well. I need to go back. But that's one thing we haven't talked about, is the Greeks would have been acquainted with this literature. They might not have known who Gilgamesh is, but they would have heard similar stories. So I think it's very natural to see connections between this and the Greek epics.
Right, and it's interesting that she lives on the edge of the sea, and the Phaeacians are sea.
Yeah.
And of course, some people say they're supposed to be Phoenicians.
Yeah.
Right? But anyway, but those people also live close to the sea, and they're known for their. So yeah, they're all these like little
Yeah.
echoes.
Which the Mesopotamians are not really seafaring peoples. So this is all pretty
It's interesting that
exotic.
for them in this, she lives next to the sea, but it's the
Yeah.
sea of death.
Yes.
There's no sense with the Phaeacians. They kind of master this sea.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can see here, you're like, you don't want to mess with the sea.
Yeah. Later, you can't even. Don't dare touch it.
Yeah, you don't want to go there.
So thinking of Ecclesiastes, I thought that there's also a lot of, Gilgamesh is plagued with acedia. He's bored with life. He can't find pleasure in being a good king. We know he has children. We know he has a wife, but they're barely mentioned. So, like, you have the whole reason Enkidu comes up is because he's this party animal, and he sleeps with every woman around because he has this insatiable lust and desire for life, I think. And he's always looking for something new to do instead of just staying where he is and being content. He has no contentment.
But his mother complains, I can't remember, the God's names in this are just crazy. I think she says to Shamash, who is
Yes.
the sun god, why did you give my son this restless heart, or make him so restless? So it
Right.
appears that he's giving these blessings. He's 2/3 God, 1/3 mortal, but he's also blessed, cursed, with this restless heart. And you can see that restlessness is part of his greatness because it makes him want to go out on the quest. But at the same time, it ultimately becomes kind of a curse.
Yeah.
Because he can't ever be at rest.
That's right. Yeah. He's also, this relationship with Shamash is interesting. So Shamash is the god, he's the sun god. He's also the god of justice. And that's a weird, so of all the gods, Gilgamesh doesn't have a good relationship with anyone but Shamash. And he and Shamash are pretty tight. And I don't understand why the god of justice likes Gilgamesh so much, because he's not really good at it. But that's one of the things that perplexes me about the book. The last thing I have as far as themes, we've talked about this already, but this is really a story about the inevitability of death and coming to terms with death. And I think that's something we're going to see in all of the books that we're going to look at, or most of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, this, what do they call it, like spoiler alert or something?
Yeah.
And really, when we sat down to pick out these books, it really was, hey, this is a short book, we can read this one. I mean, it wasn't quite that bad, because we could have gotten some pretty stupid things, but we thought, well, inevitably there will be themes that will emerge. Like last year, we didn't really have it all planned out, but there were just things that kept coming back. And I can see, as I started thinking about what we have ahead of us, this idea about, the human struggling with your mortality is really going to kind of run through all of these. And I think that ultimately that's what makes this book worth reading, is that there are certain universal themes that every thoughtful person has to struggle with. I was thinking this morning as I was getting ready, like, well, I don't even know what most people think anymore. I mean, I kind of hang around with a pretty small circle of friends, so I can't say I've got any sense of like what. Well, I don't even know what an average person is. That idea doesn't even, I don't even know what that means. But anyway, do people I mean, these kinds of books give you a way of at least kind of engaging in serious consideration about things that really matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying, like, does the Joe Bag of Donuts, the average guy, does he ever wake up thinking, does he ever have existential dread? You know, I have existential dread pretty much every morning when I wake up. So I mean, that's just me. But
You've been a teacher for a long time.
I tell the kids it's always there's this supreme moment of choice when you look in the mirror and you have the razor in your hand. What are you gonna do? It's not really that bad. If I was gonna use a razor, I'd use it on a kid. But
This is being recorded.
This is all a joke. You know what? You can't fire me. I quit. All right. Go ahead and report me to the office downtown. It's too late. But in all honesty, though, I just wonder, is there a restless, and this is what I was kind of get at, I think it appears when I look around, this kind of restless pursuit to stay one step ahead of death.
Mm-hmm.
Our obsession with youth and the appearance of youth. And when you get to be my age, and you begin thinking, you start looking around people your own age, and they're like, we're not really pulling this thing off. We're trying to look like we're young, and I in our culture, we don't. Like, I think a lot about this. How do you age gracefully? In some cultures, you just see at a certain age, a person hits a certain place, and you say, well, they're at that point in their life, and it seems right. We're still, and I do it too, so I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but, I'm wearing blue jeans and, a T-shirt with the Grateful Dead on it or something. And you think, well, this isn't, I don't know. Culturally, I just feel like, everybody's getting liposuction and dyeing their hair and I don't think
looking for glory.
Yeah, and trying to stay one step ahead of the inevitable, where really maybe it would be a lot more useful for our well-being if we would start read the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mm-hmm. Which, going back to something you talked about earlier, these books I think are going. We're also going to read some books we're going to read some Stoicism.
Yeah.
Which also is really becoming a hot item. So this is a hot item. Stoicism is a hot item. You wouldn't think it, considering how old they are. But I think part of it is that they are addressing serious things in a non-Christian format. Because so many of our, we live in this postmodern existence. People don't really know what the Christian revelation is, but they think they know it and they've already rejected it. They've created this caricature, and then they say, who would be that because they think that? And you say, well, no, actually, nobody thinks that, but that's what you think we think. But the well's been kind of poisoned in a way. But if you read this, or if you read the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, or you can begin kind of thinking about things seriously. And it's not, and people they're not standoffish about that. I'm not sure that's a good thing, but that's the way it is.
So we need to be conversant in it.
I would agree. I talked to a college professor, it's been several years now, and he said, I gave up trying to read Christian imaginative literature because it would not resonate in any way with my students. I said, I just concentrate on pagan literature. And he said, that kid, I said, it gives you an in, you can read about that, and then you can begin talking about serious things, and I thought, wow, okay, well, I guess that's good to know.
Some people have used the metaphor of like undermining, somebody's got a wall built up, like how do you get through it? You try to break it down or try to climb over it, or you dig under it, and you come up in an unexpected way.
That's an image from Hamlet, by the way, so see, they're looking ahead.
See, it all comes together.
It all comes together. Just get short books and it all comes together.
Yeah. Well, and it's a way to combat, like you're mentioning somebody who has this character of Christianity, whereas if you can show somebody that these are human questions, right? So there's a lot of like secular humanists that want to say that Christianity is all about this kind of abstract or rigid theology that doesn't really take into account the human person. Well, like read this stuff and say like these questions are human questions. They're not something that's come down from a pope saying you need to be worried about this. These are things that the human heart's been grasping at for thousands of years and hasn't found a satisfactory answer. And so then again, looking at Christian revelation then as a refining and as a perfecting.
Yeah.
So that's Gilgamesh's, the source of his sloth or his restlessness is that he doesn't really know what he's searching for.
Right.
And even when his quest, he thinks he's going to find this man who's going to give him the secret to eternal life, and what does he tell him? He says there's no permanence.
Yeah.
I mean, that's his answer to him, is that you think I've got the answer because I live here in Eden and I've been saved, I've been kind of plucked out of this existence, but his answer to him is there's no permanence, nothing's going to last. And so it's like we've got, and again, same with our world today, you have this combination of like optimism and pessimism that have come together in this weird amalgam, is that like, well, you can either really celebrate and eat, drink, and be merry, but that's not going to do it either. And so that's like he's caught in that. It's like I'm searching forever. So like I can either look for everlasting life or I can enjoy this life, but for him, because he doesn't have an understanding of the afterlife, neither one is going to be satisfying.
Yeah. I think Gilgamesh is very modern. I don't think he's that different from the kids in my courses sitting in the seats of Newman, because that whole, until somebody that he's close to dies, he's not thinking about death. He's out, he feels he's invincible. He goes out, like the scene where he goes out to kill Humbaba, and Enkidu says, wait, you don't know what you're running into here. I know about this guy in this place. He's vicious, he's gonna kill you. And Gilgamesh says, all right, then come with me.
I'll lead the way, you follow.
But I think part of that, this activity that he's always caught up in is just, it's like swipe, right? He's just filling his life with these distractions, and then Enkidu dies, and then he gets serious about wanting to live forever. And right now, some of the greatest tech minds of our generation are trying to find a way to download our consciousness or upload our consciousness into a hard drive so we can live forever. It's very much the same, that.
The good news is we're checking out before we get around.
I was going to say, up close.
There's a lot to be said for being ancient.
That's right. But the point is, even non-religious people are trying to find a way to live forever now. It's not like maybe the atheism of the late 19th century, early 20th century, where you die, that's it, I'm out of here. Now they're trying to find a way to cure death.
Why would you want to do that?
That's a good question. Because they're Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
There's more stuff to do.
See, they need to read more Greek. Look, in Greek literature, living forever in your present state, even if it was just your consciousness inside a machine, that's a form of punishment. That's not a blessed. It's not a blessed existence.
That's right.
I mean, come on, guys. They must. All right. You know what?
Tolkien and the elves who envy humankind because they've been blessed with death. You're right. They don't know what they're looking for. But ultimately they're looking for fulfillment, and they haven't been fulfilled yet.
Right.
And they feel like if they could just keep it going, eventually they're going to get there, I think. is the logic.
So do you think Achadia is that the dominant vice of our age? Would you?
I think it's one of them at least.
I mean, that's I think even more so than that sort of restlessness.
Yeah.
But at least Gilgamesh sort of knows what he's
Yeah.
looking for.
This is true.
Most people haven't. They don't even. I mean, he says he knows he's despairing of heart, so he's kind of diagnosed him that he's
Yeah,
suffering. Where, and once again, I'm generalizing, but I see a lot of people. I think, well, I don't know if they're there yet.
Yeah.
Like they're suffering from restlessness and despair, and it's sort of meaningless. They're trying to find it, but they haven't really recognized it yet.
Yeah.
So in certain ways, there's no meaningful way out of where they are.
True.
You know, it's
The other thing about Gilgamesh is I'm thinking about our culture of death as this, and that would not have made any sense to the people who gave us these stories of looking at death as this merciful way out. There's death is the enemy that you're trying to avoid at all costs. You go on this long quest and this wanting. They have no idea, no concept of resurrection at all. But there's something inside of them that longs for really resurrection. It's without, again, I think reading Gilgamesh helps you appreciate the gospel a lot more because it puts it in perspective that this isn't just. I think it's hard for us sometimes as Christians to remember what it was like to be pagan. And these are good refreshers of just like what the gospel brings that we just don't.
It's supposed to be the good news, and we kind of forget, well, it's good because it's not that,
Right.
It's not this. That's good,
That's right.
Yeah, if we don't have the bad news first, then the
Exactly.
good news doesn't quite have a place to take a seat like it would.
What time is
Well,
it?
shall we break now, or shall we do Enkidu?
You want to do Enkidu and civilization? That'll give people something to talk about.
Let's
Take a break
talk
after
about
that.
Enkidu. You had a lot of good thoughts about this. I remember Desi. You were.
Well, that was one of my favorite parts of the story is well, I guess we're kind of going back. We've been jumping around a bit, but we tend to do that. With the coming of Enkidu and the coming of civilization at the beginning of our story, and the kind of comparison and contrast that we have between that and the creation story in Genesis, the second creation story in particular. And so as we've already talked about, that Gilgamesh is in need of kind of a calming influence in his life. And so there's a couple of layers here to me. So we have Gilgamesh, who's been created good. He's been created 2/3 God, 1/3 man. But he's clearly got this restlessness, and his relationship with creation is a little different than Adam's relationship with creation. And particularly, and so that we haven't really talked about the male-female dynamic of the book yet. But I think that is introduced to us here is that what Gilgamesh needs is kind of a worthy companion that is manifested in Enkidu. So Enkidu comes as kind of the perfect match for Gilgamesh. So we don't have the creation of Eve as that Adam doesn't have a suitable partner. Eve is kind of the pinnacle then, and Adam reaches his fulfillment in Eve. In this story, it's Gilgamesh kind of reaches his fulfillment with the coming of Enkidu. So we have that, to me, is a very different slant on what it means to be Gilgamesh, is he needs this male companion. So there's some beauty there as well. And you talk about the comparison with David and Jonathan.
I just want to, I think there is a lot of the relationship between David and Jonathan. Like in the lament over Jonathan, David says, his love was to me more than the love of women. And there are echoes of Gilgamesh in that. The Enkidu is, well, when Enkidu is on his way towards Gilgamesh, because he's heard about him and he's going to fight him, right?
Yeah.
This is like perfect comic book stuff. So he's on his way to go kick Gilgamesh's butt, and Gilgamesh is having these dreams, lots of dreams as well in the book. And he has, like, there's a meteor that comes down, and he comes and he sees this meteor, and the meteor loved him like that of the love of a woman. And I think it is meant to convey kind of sexual overtones there. And he's like, who is this meteor? And, well, the meteor is Enkidu. And this is interesting because we talked about this. I don't think there's anything really homoerotic going on here. I don't think that Gilgamesh and Enkidu are that kind of friends, right? I think they have a real lively filial, phileo love for one another that our modern culture doesn't understand without.
Yeah, it has to be sex.
That's right.
But on the same hand, it could have been a slightly narcissistic identification between the two.
That's true.
Because Gilgamesh saw himself in.
And that shows up several times too. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that their relationship's really completely healthy either. But I don't think that they're homosexual lovers. At the same point, on the same hand, the relationship, the analogy is drawn between sexual relations to kind of just try to convey how important they are to one another. And I think that's what David and Jonathan you have as well. I don't think you'll find modern commentaries that say that David and Jonathan were lovers. And I don't think you have to go there. I don't think that was the intent at all. But David does mention that just to try and convey the emotion that he has that's washing over him when his friend dies.
Can you just call it closeness?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Even in intimacy.
Right.
Intimacy, there you go.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's not.
It's not sexual.
Yeah, they were a lot more comfortable with that analogy than we are. And you see
Right.
it like the Song of Songs and different places in Scripture that kind of modern people are sort of scandalized by that analogy.
Yeah, because we're hypersexualized.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
since everything is sex, you can't use sex as
Right.
a metaphor. Yeah.
Right. And so Gilgamesh has this need to be kind of tempered by a match fit for him. And then we've got Enkidu, and then that comical story of his run-in with the harlot.
Yeah.
So the civilization of Enkidu comes from this 7-day relationship with the
7 days. Yeah, he's not gay.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Enkidu is more associated with the wildness of nature.
Yeah.
Right.
And where Gilgamesh has become wild in the world of man.
Yeah.
So they need to temper. Something
Yeah.
has to happen to temper.
Yeah. And I was interested in again, just kind of juxtaposing. So in the creation story, we've got Adam and his original relationship with creation. And so Adam is created in a harmonious relationship with creation. So we talk about him cataloging the animals, he's naming the animals, he has this authority. So even there, we're seeing this separation between Adam and the rest of creation, that he's over creation as head.
By the way, when he's cataloging the animals, I think it's pretty clear he's looking for a helpmeet.
Right.
He's looking for a sexual partner
Mm-hmm.
as he's going through the animals, which that's weird for us to think about, but that's what's going on there is, and he goes through and he comes to the right conclusion that none of them are going to work in that way,
Right.
and so God wants him to come to that conclusion to show him how unique
And he
Eve
allows
is.
him to
Right.
Yeah,
come to that.
that's right.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to.
No, that's what I'm talking about. There's all these interesting, and so there's similarities, but then there's, I think, important differences too. So then with Enkidu, we have this meeting. So with Adam, this meeting with woman is kind of his crowning experience.
Yeah.
With Enkidu, we have this harmonious relationship with nature,
Yeah.
and then it's decided that relationship isn't bringing him to his fullest stature, so he needs to be civilized. And so we have, enter the harlot, and then after this encounter with the harlot, we see this falling out between Enkidu and nature, so to speak, and we see, it's manifested in the story with that the beasts are no longer responsive to him, that they won't run with him anymore, they fear him, but also that he's almost inferior to the beasts in at least in their eyes or in their perspective.
He loses some of his let's say, nature glory.
Yes, he's lost something.
Yeah.
And so, which I suppose that depends on which way you're reading the creation story too, because there's some of that when we get to chapter 3 of Genesis with the fall. So like enter the fall, we have this, again, we're brought face to face with this relationship between Adam and Eve and how that either leads them to a relationship with God or, as we see in chapter 3, disrupts that relationship with God in this way. And so we have Adam and Eve, and so I'm thinking of, there's even some lines, I need to find them, of the change that Enkidu was kind of negatively impacted by his submission almost to this woman, and that he's changed. He's no longer the man that he used to be almost. And with Adam, we've got Eve and the fall.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of like St. Augustine when he writes about, I think it's in the City of God, when he kind of reflects on original sin, and he speaks in terms very similar to terms I'm reading with Enkidu after his relationship with the woman, of what Augustine's saying about Adam is that essentially Adam has given away some of his freedom, and he's now submissive to the woman in the sense that he's done something that Eve has encouraged him to do, even though he knew it was wrong. And so there's this kind of, in a strange way, we see this heightening of Adam, but then in a different way we see this lessening of Adam too, that's reflected in his choices.
Yep.
So I just thought that was interesting, of just kind of reading those side by side almost, of how does man become civilized, and really the larger question is, what does it mean to become civilized? Like, is civilization, which trajectory is that taking man on? And then of course, as we see in the later chapters of Genesis with the descendants of Cain and the rising of civilization, is that civilization is kind of an ambiguous thing.
That's right.
Is this a good thing? Is man becoming better, or is man becoming worse? Really from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Is an interesting question. I think it's easy. We want to see man as becoming progressively better.
Yep.
But I think the opposite is easy to see too in both of these stories.
Yeah, there's an appreciation for pastoralism here, for this kind of, that the city is, there's an ambivalence towards the city.
Right. Even at the very beginning, we hear that was one of the lines that the townspeople were saying about Gilgamesh, is that they were tired of his exploits, they were tired of his kind of domination, and one of them says that, well, a king should be a shepherd. A king should be more like a shepherd to his people.
Yep. I was looking for the part that you're talking about. Okay, I found it. I think this. So it's on page 65 of the Penguin edition. So, so after 7 days and 7 nights of laying together, he's finally satisfied. He goes back to the wild beasts. Then when the gazelles saw him, they bolted away. When the wild creatures saw him, they fled. Enkidu would have followed. So he wants to go back. That is really... no, I don't want to be civilized, right? But his body was bound as though with a cord. His knees gave way when he started to run. His swiftness was gone. So these kind of like preternatural superpowers he has from being a wild man are gone. And now the wild creatures had all fled away. Enkidu was grown weak. for wisdom was in him. That's a weird passage. And the thoughts of a man were in his heart, so he returned and sat down at the woman's feet and listened intently to what she said. You are wise, Enkidu, and now you have become like a god. So it's very much like the story of
A lot of that language, even sitting down at the woman's feet and listening intently to what she said.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of similar language and dialogue.
Was she sincere or mocking
I think she's sincere. I think she's sincere. Because she wants him to come with her, and I think it seems like she basically becomes his spouse from here on, because she's around when he's dying, and he's like, "Oh, this is all your fault," and he curses her, and then he takes it back.
Yeah.
But the other thing about that that's interesting is that he there's this weird thing about him having a wife and a family that he's left before he was civilized, and that the prostitute kind of drew him away from this old spouse. And what is that? I don't know. But it's almost, you could almost look at it in terms of like evolution, you know, human, like he remembers this pre-rational state he was in where he had a family, he was happy, but he wasn't endowed with reason.
Right.
So there's kind of a sacrifice that knowledge has consequences.
Right. Well, and it's interesting that wisdom, and same with the Genesis story, is that wisdom is something that we seek after, but then what are the consequences of that? And then the fleeting characteristic of that we see later in the story when he's as a chance the tree of life is taken from him, or the plant of life. And we'll get to that after our break.
Break now.
Yeah, let's take a break now, and then we'll come to Humbaba after the break. So let's take about a 10-minute break or so, and then come with questions to start the next session.
I don't have the Akkadian text in front of me, but I would venture to say, I know that this is the case. Yeah, in Hebrew it's different. Sexual encounters always have, it's almost technical language. So I don't know if it's the
Like
same word.
copulation or something.
It's to lie with. That's almost always the way it's expressed. So it's not using that terminology. So I don't know if it's the same word in Akkadian. I'd have to do some research on that. But I can tell you that, so first of all, people absolutely had same-sex attraction in this day and age and acted upon that attraction. But at least in Mesopotamia and the Middle East, Egypt, it was not considered to be an illicit act. You would suffer if you were caught doing it. There would
So
be
it was not
it was
acceptable
illegal.
like in the gymnasium.
Oh no, they didn't do any of that in Mesopotamia. So that Greece, maybe Persia. I don't know enough about Persia. I think there is some idea that Persia accepted it. Also, ancient India. I think there's some.
About India.
But this is not. It's not something that is a part of the Middle Eastern culture
Okay, that was kind of.
until Persia kind of
And
stretched.
so was it also then in medieval times, and was that inappropriate, and people just weren't reporting? Like if squires were
I would
expected
say so.
to?
Yes.
Okay. So that's not a modern imposition like from the watershed of the Victorians on?
No.
Okay. Boy, that show. Thank you.
I don't know how prevalent the squire knight situation was.
I don't know
think that's
either.
an unusual thing, because, I mean, if you look at the code of chivalry, I don't think that would be part of a knight's description.
Right.
I don't think he was. The knights were commonly pederasts.
Yeah, I doubt
And
that that's
I
the
don't think
case.
that was that common thing.
It surely happened, but I
Surely,
don't,
but I don't
I
think
don't
it was
think
that
it was
common
a,
thing.
yeah, I would agree, but I don't know that, I don't know much about
So
that
it would
for
be
sure.
sort of an abuse of position, sort of like nowadays.
I think it would have been abuse.
Like an
Because
abusive
that's not, that's not a good
position.
idea.
Sure.
That's not a good idea. The
Yeah.
squire is going to be beside you in battle.
Yeah.
You corrupted your relationship.
Yeah,
I wouldn't think that'd be something that many knights would have done.
Well,
Yeah, there was a scene, Kristen Lavren's daughter, I think one of the sons, a knight wanted to hire one of Erlend's sons, and he detected that was his intention. But yeah, it was certainly not, the knight was trying to hide that,
Right.
and,
oh, okay, so it was.
But
so
yeah.
instead of-
It was not acceptable.
yeah,
Okay, it was an abuse.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember if Hammurabi's code talks about it, but I know it's just not, it doesn't even show up really
So it
in,
was probably a Persian influence.
I think so.
When in doubt, blame the Persians. That's usually been the Western response.
Obviously, it's explicitly outlawed in Torah. And I think it might be in Hammurabi's code as well, but I can't remember.
You mentioned that these were sung or chanted, and at one point it is referred to as a poem. Has there been a translation that's tried to maintain some kind of poetry, other than the poetry of the repetition that comes in?
So the version that Amy has and Donna has, doesn't it try to lay it out as poetry?
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
It does.
But the guy says, I just scanned just to see. He says, I don't know any Akkadian.
Okay.
So I'm not going to call this, I'm going to call this a version, not a translation.
Oh, okay. So he just widened the margins so that it looked like.
Yeah, that's part of the problem is people who really dedicate their lives to learning these languages and translating yes, that's right. They don't usually communicate on any normal sort of plane. They're not, gifted communicators typically. I'm remembering the two men that taught me Akkadian. They were weirder than all get out. They were, but I learned Akkadian from them. They do it really well.
We should talk about Umbaba.
Yeah, Humbaba. So after Enkidu becomes friends with Gilgamesh, then they go on. It really is kind of like the knight's quest first, the first half of the story, going around slaying monsters. What's weird about this is the monsters are always portrayed in somewhat positive lights. They're not terrorizing people. They're just minding their own business, out doing. And Humbaba especially, So I gave you some of the original Sumerian. I just gave you some selections. You can find these on the internet. But if I gave you this little bit, the story about Huwawa, he's called in Sumerian. It's on the second page. And the Akkadian version has really trimmed this down, and I think it loses its pathos. The way they get Huwawa in the Sumerian version is Gilgamesh says, "Hey, would you like to marry my sister?" And Huwawa says, "Sure. And let's be family." And he gives him his sister, and Huwawa in return gives him one of his glories. This is a really important concept in Mesopotamian thought, is this divine glory that the gods have, and then sometimes demigods or sacred precincts, these sorts of things, have this glory. And so he has 7 glories, and he gives one of his glories to Gilgamesh. And I cut all this out, but if you read the whole version, this happens 7 times. and he gives him something in return. And every time, they're really making a covenant with each other. By the end of this thing, I think Huwawa is really kind of another Enkidu. And he and Gilgamesh they're tight. And then when he hands over his last glory, if you look at line 149, 151. Okay, so when Huwawa had finally handed over to him his seventh terror, glory, Mulamu is what it's called. And it's really pictured as like shiny, glory stuff, right? So he's handed this all, and these are Gilgamesh's now. So now Gilgamesh is invested with all this glory. So he's given over his last one. Gilgamesh found himself beside Huwawa. So this glory was kind of like a buffer between him and his opponents. And he made as if to kiss him, but then punched him on the cheek with his fist. It's treachery. And immediately, Huwawa says, I want to talk to Utu. This is Shamash. That's his name in Sumerian. And then he has this prayer. And he says, he's really pathetic. I never knew a mother who bore me, nor a father who brought me up. I was born in the mountains. You brought me up. Yet Gilgamesh swore to me by heaven, by earth, and by the mountains. So he's praying to the god of justice, the sun, Utu. And then he grabs Gilgamesh's hand. And then look, Gilgamesh's noble heart took pity on him. And then he tells Enkidu, this is really interesting, let the captured bird run away home. Let the captured man return to his mother's embrace. So Gilgamesh is ready to let him go. And that happens in this one too. But it's the dynamic is, I think, a lot more pathetic in this version. And Enkidu, I think he's actually jealous. I've been thinking about this. Why does he do this? I think he's jealous because Gilgamesh has another Enkidu in his life. And Enkidu says, come on now, you heroic bearer of a scepter of wide-ranging power, noble glory of the gods, angry bull, staying ready for a fight. And I think this is sarcastic. Young Lord Gilgamesh, cherished in Unug, your mother knew well how to bear sons, and your nurse knew how to nourish children. One so exalted and yet so lacking in understanding. Judgment will be devoured by fate without him ever understanding that fate. The very idea that a captured bird should run away home, or a captured man should return to his mother's embrace. Then you yourself would never get back to the mother city that bore you. A captured warrior set free. And then there's all this stuff we don't really understand. And then Huwawa talks back to Enkidu. Enkidu, you speak such hateful words against me to him. And as Huwawa spoke thus to him, Enkidu, full of rage and anger, cut his throat. He chucked his head in a leather bag. It's really kind of a tragic story in the original Sumerian version, and I don't think the Assyrians knew what to do with it. So that's why I gave this to you. I think this version is better, and if you go and look for it, there's a whole site that has all this Sumerian literature translated into English, and some of it's really difficult and perplexing, but some of it, like this, is really quite beautiful. The thing that does come across in the Assyrian version that's really weird to me is Shamash is actually sending them, if I recall, to kill Humbaba. But Humbaba is living in Lebanon, which is where all the divine cedars grow. And these cedars are divine. There's a numinous quality to all of this, but I think it's the cedars, if you remember, these are what were used to build the Temple of Solomon. So this is temple-making material. And they belong to the gods. And Humbaba is the favorite of Enlil, who is the chief of the pantheon of the gods. And they just go out there willy-nilly and start chopping these trees down, which is an act of sacrilege. And Shamash, the god of justice, seems to be okay with it. And again, you have it in the next story after this, where they kill the bull of heaven, which Ishtar sins against them. Again, an act of sacrilege. This is not something, this belongs to the gods, and you are doing violence to it, which is really remarkable to me. It shows you how complicated the religious atmosphere is, that a Hebrew would never deign to go into the temple of the Lord and do this sort of sacrilege. But they, their attitude towards the god is somewhat rebellious, I think. And I think Gilgamesh. Rats foiled again.
Yeah. That's an interesting parallel.
There's something so tragic about right after that where he says, was it for this that I toiled with my hands? Is it for this that I have wrung out my heart's blood? For myself I have gained nothing.
Yeah. Vanity.
Vanity of vanity, saith the preacher holds vanity.
Yeah.
I do think that because really isn't that, that's really the end except for his death. It does seem to be that he, at the beginning of the whole poem, it talks about his arrogance.
Yes.
His arrogance has no bounds by day or night.
Yeah.
And then really this is, by the end of it, you realize that there's been I'm reluctant to say there's humility.
You're right.
But I think there's a recognition about the reality of things. I don't know, is there an acceptance? I don't know. But certainly, he realizes that that sense of arrogance it's gone now.
He goes back home.
And he goes back home.
Yeah.
To die.
Yeah. Yep. So, as far as concepts of the underworld, it's pretty cynical, pretty dark. I just wanted to share, so this is my favorite Gilgamesh story, and it's not in the Assyrian version. It's another Sumerian story. Gilgamesh, Enkidu, in the Netherworld. And in this text, I've given you a little sampling out of it. These are not long, by the way. These are about 5 pages or so. I just didn't want to give you something manageable, bite-sized.
Cut down to so many cedars.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Save the cedars of Lebanon. Don't want Enlil coming after me. So, but the way this story starts out is there's this divine tree, a chalub tree. I don't know what a chalub tree is, but a flood comes and washes it down the river, and it lands outside of Gilgamesh's palace, and he takes it and he makes himself a ball and a mallet out of this sacred tree. I get the picture like croquet, something like that. And he's going out there tapping this ball around, this sacred ball and this sacred mallet. And then in Eridug, he directed his steps. Okay, well, so he's playing with it, and somehow he knocks his ball, and I think his mallet too, into hell. Oh hell, right? And
Is that a whole
right. And he can't get it. He can't get it back.
So it's like the opposite of golf, right?
Right, that's right. You don't want it to go in the hole. So it's just a delight. I love this. Just this idea that you can accidentally lose your ball in hell. And so he's wondering how he's going to get it. And if you look here, he goes and he prays for his ball to come back at the temple. Right? Fell down into Gonzer. And then what happens is Enkidu says, well, I'll go get it. This happens in the part that I haven't given you. Enkidu volunteers to go retrieve his ball. And as he does, Gilgamesh gives him this very, very particular set of instructions. It says, don't talk to anyone, don't wear these kind of clothes. If you see your wife, don't stop and give her a kiss. Just get my ball and come back. Because if you do any of these things, you're going to be stuck down there. And this is a very common. Remember the story of Persephone. It's got that kind of atmosphere to it. Well, don't you know, at Enkidu, he goes down into the netherworld. It's a different story of how he dies, basically. He goes down to the netherworld, and he doesn't listen to Gilgamesh's advice, and now he's stuck in the underworld. And so what Gilgamesh does here, in line 238, you see, he said to the young warrior Utu, the son born by Ningal, and I think Utu might be the son, open a hole in the netherworld immediately, and then bring up his servant from the netherworld. This is what Enki says. So they bring Enkidu up, and oh, Enkidu, they hug and they kiss, and you get this tender moment between these friends that have been separated by death. And then Gilgamesh proceeds to ask him about what it's like down there. And that's the part that's really interesting to me, because we have this idea that Sheol, the Hades of the ancient Near Eastern world, was a dark, dismal place. And it certainly is for some people, but there's an idea that for others, it's not so bad. This is not the concept that would become dominant in Assyria, Babylon, and even in the Old Testament. For them, it still is kind of a shadowy domain. But for the Sumerians, it's just remarkable. So, did you see him who had one son? He says, I saw him. How does he fare? He weeps bitterly at the wooden peg which was driven into his wall. Did you see him who had two sons? I saw him. How does he fare? He sits on a couple of bricks eating bread. And the more sons you have, do you notice? The better life is in the afterlife. So by the time you get to the one who has 7 sons, as a companion of the gods, he sits on a throne and listens to judgments, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, if you have sons.
If you have sons, right? But
no daughters or men.
and remember, I talked about the funerary offerings. The spirit of him who has no funerary offerings, he eats the scraps and the crumbs tossed out into the street. Poor guy. And then there's a lot of gaps here, and I didn't give you everything, but this is the one that I like the best at the very end. Did you see my little stillborn children? Gilgamesh is asking, who never knew existence. He says, I saw them. How do they fare? They play at the table of gold and silver, laden with honey and ghee. Isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
This idea even that stillborn children have a continued existence. And it's not that bad. It's not that bad. All of this would be lost when Sumer was defeated by the Babylonians. And after that, the underworld becomes a very dark place indeed. And Christian revelation, really Jewish revelation towards the end of like around 200 BC on is when the ideas of the resurrection begin to emerge. But before that, it's best to stay alive, because who knows what happens in the underworld.
Yeah. Any final questions, comments? We've got a few minutes left.
Well, just with what Matthew was just talking about, in the church where we believe in purgatory.
Right.
Not all Christians believe in that other place called purgatory. But again, as I said, according to how your life is lived, where you are in purgatory,
Yeah.
how much closer to hell you may be. You just may have been a step away. And need lots of prayer, lots of masses.
Yeah.
So,
Those funerary offerings, they do kind
right.
of remind us of.
What is it doesn't really have to do with the novel, but what is the like Orthodox Jewish version of afterlife?
Oh. Okay, so
I mean,
before.
is it just nothingness?
Oh, no.
Okay.
It depends on which Orthodox Jew you're asking. Before the Middle Ages, They would have believed very similar to what we do, of a paradisical state before resurrection. And so Maimonides, he came up with these, it's basically a creed, 13 things that you have to believe before breakfast. And one of those is the resurrection. And he says, if you don't believe this, you're not really a practicing Jew. Well, the Middle Ages come along, and Kabbalah comes in, and this idea of reincarnation and even kind of pantheistic stuff emerges, and it gets all confused after that. But before the Middle Ages, our beliefs in paradise and the resurrection are actually taken almost straight from Judaism, from Pharisaism, really. But that didn't really emerge so most of our Old Testament is written before that doctrine had fully developed.
There's a movie out that came out recently called Coco.
Oh, yeah.
And Howard, your comments about how do we as older generations maintain memories of us so that we can be prayed for by our generations that are coming up. And that movie portrays that theme. It's animation.
Oh, okay. Oh, I think I've heard of it.
And it's got a great deal of family, familial kinds of concepts and traditions in it. And it's Mexican based because it has the skeletons and that kind of tradition there.
It all takes place during Dia de los Muertos.
Yes, exactly. And then there's another one, Marvel characters that of recent, I don't follow the stuff, but I happen to tune in. And one of these, he looks like a god. He's collecting the 7 stones.
Oh, yeah, Thanos.
All powerful. What's that?
Yeah, Thanos.
Oh, you know what?
Yeah, so sorry.
Thank you, because I forgot his name. You know it. Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting.
How does Thanos tie into all this? I'm confused.
Well, he's gathering these stones, and there's this conflict to prevent him from obtaining all of them. And when he gets the last one, he is powerful over all of creation.
Yeah.
And
making a name for himself.
yeah, and these other heroes begin to vaporize.
Yeah.
That were trying to fight him.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Modern mythology.
Well, but it reminds me of things you're talking about today in class. They're reviving some, and I wonder, have they read Gilgamesh? These people
some of
that
them
produce these movies and write these scripts.
Stan Lee did. I'm sure of it. Stan Lee, the guy who did a lot of the Marvel, and now we're talking about Marvel comics.
Well, you said this was a comic book.
No, but Stan Lee was very well read in mythology. Yeah, he talks about that. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So you think you can come to a class like this and I can get away from my nerdy kids, but I guess.
I'm a nerdy kid.
I make fun of them all the time.
Okay, so next week it's...
And what is it next week?
Antigone, right?
Oh, Antigone. All right, good.
Antigone.
Oh, you'll like Antigone.
We've got lunch served now, so hope you can stay and join us for lunch downstairs before you leave. But next week we'll do Antigone. Like I said, I think I'm sold out of copies downstairs, so I apologize for that. But 8th Day Books, I hope has... Did you ever say anything about Antigone? Or just this is popular?
I didn't ask her about Antigone, but...
Well, right on Antigone.
Evidently, there's a really good translation online. I didn't look at it, but I read that it was...
You can't find it
People
online.
think it's really a good translation.
Okay.
Free online.